It's such a wonderful thing to have Gina with us, because Gina, have a true respect for the work that you've done for the Humanitarian Coaching Network to initiate this discussion among coaches, because I think that's indeed an area where we have to be, first of all, aware of it and start a conversation for the community and for all of the coaches to exchange on anti-racism and social justice, and define from there, what do we learn and what are the things that we have to be aware of, and how do we handle those situations as coaches. So that is the framework of today's conversation, and that is the framework that we want to invite you all to share your thoughts, share your opinions, share your experiences, I think. And what can we learn from those things? I know, Gina, that you had a lot of things prepared for us, and more than sure that I'm speaking in the name of both of us, Vlad, when I'm saying this is definitely a session that we've been waiting for, and we've been searching for the right person that can introduce us to this concept and allow this conversation to take place. And we're extremely thrilled to have met you and had also all of those wonderful conversations before when preparing the session, and see that sparkle in your eyes whenever we were talking about something that was hitting the subject of, so now what do we do as coaches? And it was lovely to see also now realize when we started and you said, you know what, I found 2 more things that were really interesting in this topic, so I'm going to share them with you, which is a beautiful way of saying how important the topic is for you and how much you have to share. So Gina, thank you so much again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Vlad. It's truly, it is an honor and a privilege, truly a privilege to be here with you. And, you know, it's interesting what you just mentioned, Christina, because for me, from my perspective, this aspect of the work that I do is a lifelong journey. And it's a lifelong journey of learning. There's so much to learn and to embrace, and both in terms of myself, learning about myself and understanding who I am, but also learning about the world and learning how I need to or want to really show up in the world. And, you know, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but, you know, in terms of thinking about all of this in the context of coaching, one of the things for me that's really exciting and that's been happening, that I'm seeing that's happening recently within the coaching industry, is more of a focus and an interest in looking at our clients in context. So not just thinking about this individual that's in front of me almost as an isolated being, but really thinking about who this person is in the context of their lives, their lived experiences, the systems and the structures that potentially may have an impact on them. So, you know, I've been really excited to see the updated ICF competencies that are now starting to embrace this idea of context and thinking about that from a coaching perspective. So I want to just bring that in as a way to frame our conversation and to invite you throughout this workshop today to think about all of what we'll be talking about through that lens of thinking about how this really, what the meaning is for you as coaches when we talk about this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you, if that's okay, if I can find the screen I'm looking for. There it is, find the screen I'm looking for. Christina, are you seeing the third way? Are you seeing the PowerPoint?
I can see the PowerPoint, yes.
Okay, great.
It's on the screen.
Yeah, for some reason it wasn't popping up right on my screen. Okay, and you can still see it with the globe on it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, good. So this is our topic for today, understanding power and privilege, and thinking about it in the context of creating cultures of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really thinking about all of that from the perspective of who we are as coaches. I want to begin today by acknowledging where I am in the world in this moment. I am sitting in Buffalo, New York, in the United States of America, and I would like to start by acknowledging that I sit on native ground. Ancestrally, the lands referred to as New York State are the homelands of many native nations, including the Lenape, Nanticoke, Powhatan, Lenni, Sandhill, Manhattan, Delaware, Unkachog, Shinnecock, Montauk, Abenaki, Mohican, Wenro, Huron, and the Haudenosaunee nations of the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, as well as many more nations and peoples. We respect the treaty rights of Indigenous peoples throughout New York and the obligation of the United States and the New York governments, as well as the American society, to adhere to them. We honor the legacy of the many ancestors and elders who made these lands their home and infused it with their spirit for thousands of years. We also honor the original peoples who remain on the ancestral homelands of Turtle Island, that's the United States, and who have survived centuries of colonization, genocide, and land theft. Finally, we honor those who are not here, but who would have been here were it not for this history of violence. With hearts and minds focused on healing and truth, we commit ourselves to advocate for inclusion and restitution for past atrocities. May we all inspire to a world of reconciliation, guided by the example of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Great Law of Peace, so that our weapons of war are buried forever and that mutual respect and equity prevail among all nations and peoples. So a little about what brings me to this work. So I'm a coach, I'm a facilitator, I lead programs and workshops in the diversity and inclusion space, in anti-racism, also in leadership, and I do some mindfulness training, and I also do some work in the creativity and innovation space. But in particular, what brings me to this, and this is really the work of my soul, is I've always been, from the first moment I can remember, I've always had a passion for, oh, you can see on the screen my next slide. Okay, thank you for letting me know that. Hang on, let me just do this one more time. Is that better?
It's the same. I don't mind. I just don't know if it has a story, so we don't
okay,
reveal too much.
No, that's fine. Usually that works. I'm just going to reshare. Give me one moment. I'm going to reshare this and see if it works properly. And if not, I'll use the other method of screen share. So let me know. How's that? How is that? Full screen or no?
Full screen.
It's full screen?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Lovely.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for letting me know. I've always, for as long as I can remember, I've always had a passion for social justice. I was brought up in a family that I'm Jewish by heritage. I was brought up in a family of people who were very progressive, but it's always just been in my blood, in my DNA. I don't know why, it's just been there. And then, so, you know, I think of myself as a citizen of the globe. And then there's these two incredible humans who happen to be my children, who are amazing individuals. And my experience as a white woman raising two Black children in the United States of America has really been an eye-opening experience, and is really a lot of what fuels my passion for doing this work. So a little bit just to set a framework for how we'll work together, some things in terms of our contract. I would ask, there will be some, we will be doing a breakout later on, and we may have some space for, when we have space for conversation, I invite you to maintain confidentiality. Speak your truth. This is absolutely a space that's available. Speak your truth and speak for yourself. So from your own experience, what you know, and your own truth. Some of what we may be talking about may create some discomfort. It often does, this conversation about power and privilege. So I invite you to really to self-manage and to take care of yourself, and be loving to yourself in whatever way you need. We don't really talk about safe space, because when we get into these conversations, it's rarely safe in the sense of, I think of safe almost as being comfortable. So the invitation here is for brave space, and space for all the voices. And I invite you to bring a beginner's mind, which is to seek to challenge your assumptions, your own personal assumptions. And although we as human beings, we are meaning-making machines, that's what we do. We survive in the world because we are able to assess and evaluate and make lots of judgments about lots of things, so we know how to operate. At the same time, that sometimes can get in the way. So we recognize that judgment is a part of life, but we seek to try to reduce that or mitigate it to whatever extent we can. I'm going to start with a few definitions. I want to begin actually by talking about the concept of culture. And so much of what we're talking about, certainly in an environment when we're talking with our clients, is we're really looking at what is the cultural environment that we're operating in. And we can think of culture both in terms of the formal, the visible culture, from an organizational perspective, that's vision, strategy, policies, values, structures, goals, or you can even think of that even from a family, in a family unit or in a community. And that's the part of, it's the way that we say that we get things done. And then there's the subculture, the invisible aspects to culture, the unspoken rules and the unconscious rules, the things that live below the surface, our unwritten rules, the norms, the stories that we tell, the feelings that we have, the traditions that we maintain, the beliefs, all of that, which often lives below the surface, is a significant part of our culture. And in a way, we can think of that is the way that we really get things done. That's so much of what's under the surface is what really drives how we engage, or in any kind of a community, any kind of a community environment. So in terms of definitions, diversity, having a quality or state of many different forms. So diversity, when we think about diversity in the context of organizations, we talk about, this is the process of inviting lots of different folks into the room. So we have different people from different cultures, different ages, different races, different genders, maybe some people who are what we would consider neurotypical, or different work styles, different perspectives, different lived experiences. We bring them together into the room. Equity, and we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. One way to think about equity is to think about it as, if we think about the way that the world often operates, the reality of how the world is structured, and what each of us has available to us in terms of resources and access to resources, this is often the reality. When we talk about equality, equality implies that everybody gets the same thing. You get $10, you get $10, Vlad gets $10, Christina gets $10, I get $10, we all have $10, kind of regardless of whether we need $10 or whether we need $100, we're all getting the same thing. When we talk about equity, we're talking more about ensuring that everyone gets what they need to survive and to thrive. And so if you don't need $10, you might not get $10, and somebody who needs $10 might get $10, and I might need $1,000, so I get $1,000. It's a very kind of simplistic way of thinking about it, but I think this image really expresses it. And then, this whole concept is really, we're also starting to think about, all right, what would some people would label this as justice, or maybe label it as liberation. What if we were to even just break down those systems and structures that even create the barrier? What if we were to just take down the fence? So equity, we can think of equity as fairness that's focused on ensuring that everyone gets what they need to both survive and to thrive. And in an organization, it's really about creating environments where people can engage and can contribute. We all have this, I think most human beings, when we wake up in the morning, we put our feet on the floor, we have a desire to contribute, to be a part of something, to have that there's meaning, there's a reason why we go through our lives and we do the things that we do. And so really being in an environment where we're able to contribute, we're able to come home at the end of the day and feel like, yeah, that was a good day. That really, I felt like there was a value to my participation today. And then inclusion. So we talked about diversity. Diversity is having a bunch of different types of, however we're defining groups or identities. Inclusion, that's diversity. Equity is making sure that everyone gets what they need. And then inclusion is the process of really creating space and inviting in. So we can have a room full of people who all look really different, but if the culture still focuses on, I'll use as an American example, a white male Christian who, person of Christian or WASP background who is, 45 years old and carries themselves with a certain kind of a sense of almost entitlement, that those are the people that we point to, that we listen to, that we pay attention to. Having a lot of different people in the room doesn't necessarily create inclusion. And so that's part of where our work really comes in, is once we're able to bring people to the table, how do we then create that environment where that is fully inclusive? So I invite each of you to take a moment and think of a time when you felt excluded, when you felt like you were, maybe it was something in an experience you had in school. Maybe it was an experience you had in a working environment. Maybe it was something that happened in a community group that you were involved with, in a sports activity. But take a moment and think about and remember what that actually felt like for you. And what was the impact both on you psychologically, and how did that impact your participation and your desire to contribute? And if anyone would like to put in something in the chat to share, please feel free. And if you would like to come off of mute and actually share your experience and let us hear your voices, feel free. So I'll take a moment and let you reflect and see if anyone also would like to share what that experience was like for them. And if you prefer, you can put your thoughts into the chat. Anyone want to share? Monica says, it inhibited my performance. I felt left aside and not valued. Yes. You know, we think about as human beings, we have evolved through our ability to collaborate. We can't survive on our own. And because of that, it's really embedded in our DNA. It's part of who we are, that we want to belong. We want to feel included. And one of the most painful experiences I think that we have as human beings is to be pushed out and dismissed and not heard and not seen. We'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. But, you know, think about how much that's really baked into who we are as human beings. I think, you know, yes, felt left aside and not valued. And then also when you have that feeling, for most of us, it inhibits our desire to participate. It gets in the way of our ability to really engage and feel like why do I want to put myself forward in this? Why do I really want to why do I want to put my energy into a situation or in with a group of people who don't value? Yes, it is absolutely our need for connection and love. It is. And, you know, occasionally I find myself in situations, in organizational environments, excuse me, where they actually are starting to use that word, the word love. Not many, and it's not frequent, but it's absolutely so much a part of who we are. And if what we're trying to create are environments of inclusion, then our ability to really bring our hearts forward and connect with other people and be empathetic and compassionate is a huge part of being able to make that happen. So in talking about this, you know, talking about the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, why it matters is, you know, for organizations, there's a lot of data now out in the world around the actual, talking just from a financial bottom line perspective, the performance of organizations that have high levels of inclusion versus those that don't. There's a lot of metrics that show that it absolutely impacts the bottom line. It impacts our creativity. It impacts our employee engagement. It impacts our ability to really reach a diverse customer base. So there's a multitude of impacts from an organizational perspective. For us as leaders, as coaches, as mentors, as trainers, we have a responsibility really to understand the individuals that we serve and the context. We talked about this a little bit at the very beginning, but understanding the context of people's lives and the systems and the structures that impact their experience. And so part of that may be you know, how we've grown up, the environment that we're in, the level of privilege or the kinds of opportunities that have been in front of us have a big impact on our sense of agency, on our sense of our ability to really create the life that we want to have. I grew up in a home where I was told from the moment I was born that I could be anything that I wanted to be if I put my mind and my heart to it. My daughter, who works with at-risk teens here in Buffalo, New York, works with kids who from the moment they're born grow up in an environment, not all, but some of those kids are grown up and their goal is to make it to 18 and still be alive and still be breathing. And so you think about, you know, as you move forward in your life, the impact that has on your sense of your own power and control, your own sense of agency. And then finally, you know, for all of us, we are members of a human family, and we have an opportunity, each one of us, in one way or another, we have an opportunity to create a different kind of a world. So I want to just speak for a moment on the topic specifically of race, this, you know, and framing this conversation and talking about anti-racism. Human beings genetically are among the most similar of all the species on Earth. We are 99.9% alike genetically. There is 2 times more genetic diversity between 2 penguins, and there is 10 times more genetic diversity between 2 fruit flies than there are between 2 humans. And in fact, there's a good chance that I have more genetically in common with David in Kenya than I do with my next door neighbor. Believe it or not, we are that much alike. And so, so as I said, you may very well have more in common with someone across the globe than a person who's sitting next to you. Ancient societies didn't divide by race. They did divide, and certain, you know, they divided by religion, by class, by language, but not necessarily by physical characteristics. And race, as a differentiator, the way we know it and think of it today, is a social construct. It's a construct that was invented, invented in the 16th century to justify the chattel slavery of African people by Europeans. So it was invented, it's actually started in Portugal. It was invented by the Portuguese as a way of justifying chattel slavery. And so in many ways, race is not real, except that it is, because we live in a racialized world. And so from a scientific genetic perspective, it doesn't exist. From a social and cultural perspective, it exists in significant ways in so much of the way that of the world that we experience today. So I want to just give you a bit of a framework also for thinking about inequities and inequalities, thinking about racism and other forms of oppression. As you're thinking about your own experiences, thinking about the experiences of your clients and how they're lived, you know, the layers and the levels potentially of their lived experiences, of your lived experiences, just to give some framework. Oftentimes there are a lot of conversations around anti-racism and anti-oppression that have to do with changing hearts and minds, that if we can change hearts and minds, we can solve the problem. There are a lot of conversations around systems and structures. If we can change the systems and structures, we can solve the problem. And I, from my perspective and from my learning, I really believe that it's a yes and, that we have to come from both. We need to bring both of those aspects into the conversation. So thinking about the levels and the layers, as individuals, we have feelings, we have beliefs, we have values, we have biases. We all have biases. We just do. It's part of growing up in a world, in a culture, in a society. And so from my perspective, a lot of the work that we do around bias is around, it's not trying to eradicate it. It's trying to uncover it, to recognize it, to look at it, to examine it, and then to be able to say, okay, how do we manage it? At the interpersonal level, we can think about how we act, how we interact, our behaviors, our language, and to what extent they are They are equitable and non-oppressive and anti-racist. At the institutional level, we can think about what happens in terms of our legal and our educational systems, our laws, public policies, hiring practices in organizations. Oftentimes, oftentimes recruiting happens at the same institutions that brought the current CEO is a graduate of. They reach out to they're always recruiting from the same institutions. We have this cycle of, and it's not something that's necessarily articulated, but it's embedded in the organization when we think about where we go to find talent to come to work within our companies. And then finally, we can think about it at the systemic level. And this is how dynamics of power and privilege really infiltrate everything within our social, political, economic systems. This really is what becomes the norm, and our assumptions about what is good and what is right. And so it infiltrates that whole cultural iceberg really becomes infiltrated with these dynamics. And the interesting thing about it is that all of these layers and levels impact each other. So who I am as an individual, I'm involved in making public policy. So my individual feelings and beliefs will impact public policy. What's happening within the system and the concepts that I'm raised with about what's right, what's good, what is the norm what the system tells me will impact how I feel, which impacts how I engage with other people. So all of these levels and layers are constantly interacting and impacting on each other. So I'm going to take a moment. Actually, let me just check in and see if there's any questions, and we're going to step into this specific topic around privilege. Are there any questions in the moment that are feeling like anything you want to ask, add? And we'll have a little bit of time. Hopefully we'll have a little time left at the end for questions as well. Okay. So this is a word, it's interesting based on, and many of you may have different relationships to this word. Here in the United States, this word has become really charged. It's a word that often creates a lot of discomfort. It's a word that often creates a sense of defensiveness amongst people. I'd be curious when we get into some conversation later to find out, to hear more about how this word, how you hear this word based on your particular environment and where you are in the world right now. How we define it is a set of rights and their rights and benefits that are granted to those in the dominant group. You may have those rights or benefits by birth, based on, say, race or gender. It may be by acquisition. So your socioeconomic status may change, your wealth may change, your educational level will change. And so some of those things may change throughout your life. And these are, so based on your membership, there are rights and benefits. You may be aware, you may not be aware, even be aware of what they are, but they create an unfair advantage, an unfair playing field. One way often used one metaphor I often use to talk about privilege is it's like water to a fish. It's like the air we breathe. It's just the way it is. And unless we're in a situation that really asks us to challenge or to investigate or to explore, to examine what's happening around us, there's not necessarily any reason why we would, because it's just simply the way the world is. You know, I grew up with the belief that I can be anything I want to be when I grow up. That's just the way the world is. The world is organized to, the world is organized. There's an invitation for me to step forward in many ways, not in all, but in many ways. And so I think about, like I said, I think about this, or I often use this metaphor of water to a fish. So much when we talk about issues around privilege, it relates to aspects of our identity. And so when we think about who we are, and these are just a few, the examples that I'm going to give you, but they're some of the really key ones that we often associate, or that often are associated with varying levels of privilege. So gender, absolutely. Our race, our ability level, whether we are fully able-bodied or we have a disability, an unseen or a seen disability, our religion or our religious affiliations or our religious heritage, our sexual orientation, and also we could include in that maybe our gender expression, ethnicity, our age. I mean, that's one that's changing all the time, whether we like it or not. And class, or what we sometimes refer to as socioeconomic status. So those are some of the big ones. There are lots of other aspects of our identity. And you can see that there's, you know, we all fit into various different aspects in various different categories. I would invite any of you, if you're interested, to do a little, if you like TED Talks, check out Kimberly Crenshaw does an amazing TED Talk on intersectionality, where she talks about how sometimes the way that these various different identities interplay and create a whole different level and a whole different dynamic in terms of how the world perceives us. So, so talking about identity. I want to start, before we really get deep and heavy into the conversation about privilege, is I want to introduce you to a client of mine. His name is Steve. Oh, that wasn't his real name. He was a real person. This is a real story. This is not his real picture, but it's pretty close. That's kind of what he looks like. And Steve was, he's straight, he's white, he's male. He was 45 years old. He identified as Christian, middle class, college educated, cisgendered, which means that his gender identity matches his sex at birth, and he's able-bodied. So when you look at Steve, and if I look at Steve in relationship to those identity areas that I just showed you, Steve checks all the boxes. Check, 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 check. Got it made. Life is good. Life is easy. Yay. Don't we all want to be Steve? Well, I don't really want to be Steve, but you get the drift. But the truth of it is that Steve's mom died by suicide when he was 6 years old. And he has been dealing with that pain ever since. He also recently found out that she was an alcoholic, which explains a lot of the chaos of his family of origin. I share Steve with you because regardless of how many opportunities we have, regardless of how we were born and how many boxes we can check, life is difficult. Being a human being is difficult. Being a human being is painful. We all experience pain. We all work hard to get where we want to get to do the things that we want to do. We all deal with challenges and confusions and traumas in our lives. It's part of the human experience. And when we're talking about privilege, we're talking about another layer that gets built on top of oftentimes the pains, the pains of human life, there are then these added layers and these added challenges. So I say this because sometimes when we talk about privilege, people get very defensive, and I hear a lot of, well, I worked really hard and nobody ever gave me anything, and everything I've had in my life, I've worked for and I've strived for. And yes, that's true. And even so, there are others who are starting way back, or who have additional hurdles in front of them and challenges. So when we talk about privilege, I love this quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So we're going to do an activity, and and Monica said, yes, the mix between nature and nurture. For some people, the nurture is not there at all. Yes, absolutely. Sometimes it's not there in a family environment. Sometimes it's not there in the cultural environment, in the way that our social systems are organized, for sure. So this activity is originated from a woman by the name of Peggy McIntosh. Started this a number of years ago. It's been adapted many times. We've adapted some of the language of this. And we talk about the privilege knapsack. And the one way to think about that is, imagine that you're getting ready to go on a trip around the world, and you have in your knapsack maps and visas and credit cards and guidebooks and maybe a GPS and a translator and all the tools that you might need to smooth that journey, to make it really to ease your journey. You can think of all of those tools that are in your knapsack as a kind of privilege. So what I'm going to invite all of you to do is hopefully you have a pen or a piece of paper or something in front of you that you can write, and if not, you can just reflect as we go through this activity. I'm going to read you a series of statements, and I'm going to ask you that for each of the statements that I read, that you, if this statement is true for you, make a check mark, or give yourself a point or an X or whatever marking you want. And if it's not, then just leave it, you can just leave it blank. And really the intention of this exercise is not necessarily what your actual score is at the end of the activity. It's more to begin to reflect on what your experiences are, and what the experiences might be of people who don't necessarily have privilege in the same kind of way. So I'm going to start with the area of ability. So the first statement is, I can assume that I will easily have physical access to any building. So if this statement is true for you, give yourself a check or a point or an X. Easily assume that I will have physical access to any building. People do not question my right to reproduce or to be an effective parent based on my ability status. If that's true for you, give yourself a check. I have never been taunted, teased, or ostracized due to a seen or unseen disability. As it pertains to ethnicity or nationality. I have never been told not to speak in my native language during everyday interactions. People do not assume I am poor because of my ethnicity or my nationality. People do not question my intelligence or my right to be in the country in which I live because I speak with an accent. As it pertains to class and wealth, I never felt an opportunity was closed to me because I didn't know how to speak or dress or act. I don't have to rely on public transportation. I can afford my own vehicle. I have access to relatively clean air and water and healthy food options. I have never been hungry except by choice. I have never received public assistance. As it pertains to gender, I do not have to worry that my wardrobe sends a message about my sexual availability. I have never been denied a job, been paid less for comparable work, or had a less qualified person promoted over me because of my gender. If I have children and a career, few people will ask how I balance my professional and private life. I've never been denied opportunities to attend school, work, drive, or engage in other daily activities because of my gender. As it pertains to race, I can go shopping alone most of the time and be pretty well assured I will not be followed or closely watched by store employees because of my race. I can look at the mainstream media and find people of my race represented fairly and in a wide range of roles. I was raised to believe the police were there to help me in an emergency. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. As it pertains to sexual orientation and gender identity, I have no fear of being fired or denied employment because of my sexual orientation or gender identity. I was never bullied or shamed for being LGBTQIA+. People don't ask why I chose my sexual orientation. I can show affection to my romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence. As it pertains to religion, I'm comfortable wearing clothing or jewelry relating to my religion without fear of reprisal. I have never been called a terrorist or any other slur as a result of my religious affiliation. Implicit or explicit references to religion where I work or go to school conform to my religious beliefs. As it pertains to First Nations and Indigenous status, the sovereign rights of my people are readily recognized by the governing bodies where I reside. My people have not been subjected to forced assimilation. I've never been told to go back to the reservation. No one will assume I am prone to alcoholism, violence, drug addiction, criminality, or poverty based on my identification as Indigenous or a member of the First Nations. And finally, some general thoughts. People in power in organizations, religious institutions, and government are mostly people like me in terms of ability, nationality, class, gender, race, indigeneity, religion, and sexuality. the more prestigious and powerful the position, the more this is true. I have health insurance and can be reasonably assured that healthcare providers and institutions I engage with will listen, respond, and treat me with care and respect. I am relatively confident that my civil rights and the rights of my family will be honored and respected regardless of my ability, nationality, class, gender, race, indigeneity, religion, or sexuality. And I invite you to take a breath. It's a lot. I realize that that can be a lot to process. What I'd like to do is I'm going to actually pop these questions that are on here in the chat. And I was going to do this as breakouts, but I think we're a small enough group that I think we can do this as a conversation together in the room. So some questions for us to think about, and then I'm going to end the screen share so we can see each other. Insights about what insights you have from this activity, what this idea of an unfair playing field, how it makes you, how you feel about your own privilege or lack, thinking about how noticeable our privileges may be, insights that we have into the experiences of people who have been marginalized, and thinking about how some of these dynamics might show up in our coaching and our mentoring relationships. So, yes, go ahead, Chrissy.
Gina, I'm gonna jump in and put a thought in there. As we have 3 participants that, at least 2 of them that were not willing. It's fine that they were not sharing their screen, their camera and everything. I'm wondering if we should just ask, and if they want to put in the chat, if they want to have 10 minutes or just a short discussion in the breakout room where they can freely talk without being broadcasted or anything. And if after that come back and share. So that I'm assuming that in here they won't be willing to engage as much, as we'll be keeping more of the confidentiality of the discussion if we move indeed in a breakout room. So for the 2 other persons that are on the call with us, if you're fine of just moving into a breakout room, just put a short yes or no in the chat so we know how it would be best for you also to proceed. We are still waiting for a response from them. I would say, from my perspective, the discussion was extremely interesting, and I think we will be nevertheless continuing the conversation in here. So if there's no need for a breakout room, to just really freely share your thoughts, if you're fine of putting things in here in the chat or just putting up your mic, that we can also stay like this. David, what would be best for you? Because I see that you've stayed with us constantly. I think that we can ask you directly.
Yeah, I don't have any problem. Anything I can say, I would be able to say in public or in private.
Great. So any first thoughts, first reactions to the activity that we just did, or really to any of the material that we discussed, but in particular thinking about this concept of power and privilege? What are some of the first reactions, responses? Vlad, I can see you're nodding your head. I'm curious.
Indeed, I do think that this topic, it's harder to internalize rather than rationalize. And hearing you, one of my thoughts was that actually, indeed, based on transactional analysis, everyone, or almost everyone, want to be okay. The one problem that we have is that we are used to get our okayness in comparison with the others' okayness. And this is one thing that probably it makes us individuals to look for privilege in regard with the others. The second thing that I realized listening to you is that probably in our heritage, we used to grow in tribes. And also, we look to the best tribe, or how our tribe could survive better than the others. And this is make what we hearing almost everywhere, we versus they. And especially in corporate, I hear a lot of our department versus headquarter, or versus other department. And I always provoke them and ask them, you are the same family in the organization. What makes you see distinction, we versus they? And this is most, let's say, not most, less evident when it's about power and privilege. Otherwise, it's very easy. And with Christina doing this festival, which started from culture, diversity, multi-language, it's very easy to see diversity and different culture when we talk about different countries, different continents, different colors, different sex, or sorry, different gender. And reality is that it's happened in the same group. And I realize an interesting story with my colleagues from the undergrad student, undergrad studies. And 20 years later, we gather together and we find something very interesting. Those people from Bucharest, their own birth town, and the university town, was very, how to say, jealous on those who was on coming from other cities, because they have to stay with their parents. On the other side, the other colleagues coming from different cities, they was jealous on us because they wasn't from the city. And it was something that I never thought about it as a privilege and some kind of power. And we needed about 20 years to grow up to be able to talk about this without any hard feelings.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting in a way, Vlad, that what you're speaking to is this you know, you talked about the tribal nature in the sense that, and again, I think it goes back to, you know, our survival as human beings, and so often it became it's an either or. So either we thrive or you thrive, but we don't all thrive. And to me, what I see is sort of this almost a paradox of human nature, which is that we all have the capacity to be incredibly kind and compassionate and loving and open and generous. And we all have the capacity to stratify and create hierarchies and develop structures of power and privilege. And really, they can show up in so many different ways. Like we talked about a set of identities, but you know, one of the conversations that we've had through the HCN, and particularly in working with coaches across the globe, is that so much of this is contextual. It depends on where you are, where you hold privilege or don't hold privilege. So, you know, and David, I don't mean to point you out, but you know how you're viewed in a country where you are in a country where most people look like you, as opposed to operating in a country where most people look like me. You'll have a very different set of experiences. And then starting to look at some of those subtler ways, like this department and that department, or this organization or that and that organization, or you know, the ways that we do stratify and create systems of power and privilege. I think it's, you know, I think we all have that capacity within us, as we all have the capacity, or most of us have the capacity for compassion, unless, you know, somehow that got, you know, for a few people, maybe it's we've lost that sense. Christina, did you have something you wanted to
share? I wanted to invite David and anyone else that wants to share to just please go ahead. I think that's important.
Yes.
Open up.
Yes. Actually, as you are, if the last point you made, you almost took a point out of my mouth, because as you're going through the questions, there was something that kept coming to mind, that the answer to that question would be so different during the time, for example, I worked in London than when I work in Nairobi. When I work in Nairobi, I have a lot of ticks on the privilege side, because I live in a neighborhood which is okay, which is top neighborhoods. I don't lack food, I don't lack anything, I don't get discriminated by anybody. I don't have to look behind as I move anywhere. Now, I unfortunately would love to say the same if in a different context, but I have faced that reality. And the thing that was going at the back of my mind in a deeper sense is just that contextual reality of power and privilege, that it's so contextual. And I thought about nature, that where we are, we thrive in different places in different ways. And if I think deeply about nature, is that I believe nature had balanced a lot of things before a lot of the migrations and everything. Where you are, you most likely are privileged in a number of ways. But because of the migrations and everything, you find yourself now having to deal with different realities at different places where you work or live. And being conscious about that then, and just being bold enough to face, having the courage to face that conversation and say, you know what, this person may look different, this person may talk differently, but this person is actually a very much stronger person and very much privileged person in a different context than in this particular context. And all those things lived consciously then would even out the sort of friction that you have in the world, with all of us knowing there is enough for us, not enough for our greed, but there is enough for everybody to be able to enjoy a decent standard of living, a decent opportunity to proceed and become that which you choose to be. So bringing that to conscious awareness is a much bigger thing than trying to look at how somebody else is taking advantage of you. I think it's being very conscious about the fact that there's enough, the abundance thought that there is enough for all of us.
Yes, there's absolutely. It's a little mind-boggling when you consider that this was a recent statistic that I saw, that the 8 richest men in the world own or control as much wealth as the as the lower half of the human population. So 3.6 billion people own or control the same amount of wealth as the 8 richest. It's a little mind-boggling. And the gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger in a world where, you know, as you said, there is enough to go around. There really, truly is enough to go around. So, yeah, absolutely. And thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience of that must be really fascinating, though, to have had your feet in both of those worlds and had that experience of being viewed so differently in one place as you are in another. I wish I could kind of get inside your skin and know what that actually really felt like for you, but yeah.
I will soon. I know I've promised this to Christina and Vlad. They are waiting for my book. I will be putting some of that experience in a book, which I keep pushing the launch date further and further.
Yeah,
it's interesting living. It's interesting living a minority in the global space because I obviously within the global space I feel a minority in a lot of places. But it's interesting when you empower yourself with the knowledge that you have anything and everything that anybody else, and the chances of you living and thriving are equivalent to anybody else.
Yeah.
But the world may think differently.
Yeah. And in fact, even though we have people of European heritage have managed to control a lot of power and wealth, we are in the minority in terms of numbers on this planet, for sure.
Thank you both of you for sharing and bringing this into perspective, and saying in one place you can be in a privileged position, in one place you may not be, and it's around the context. And there's another thought that comes to my mind, and it's one of the things that I think I shared now in the chat also with Vlad, is how willing are we to take that step? Maybe like you were saying, put a pause and just look at it and try to shift the lenses. And how willing are we to do that as that might bring us in a bit in this position of cognitive dissonance, if you want to go in that perspective, and saying, I don't believe that I'm like that. I don't believe that fits with me. And I don't believe that I have to do that. And I'm wondering now how much of that exercise we need to do to make sure that we are aware of those differences, different privileges in different spaces and in different contexts.
That's a fantastic question, Christina, and I can tell you from where I sit, it's a very deliberate thing that we've got to get a critical mass of people thinking that way. If you think about it, I am in a generation where the people before me actually I was born just when my country was gaining independence from colonial rule. So you can imagine the sort of stories I had when I was a young person. Is my parents and their people around them and those around me are people who had actually experienced the extreme colonialism. And those stories, if you don't live them consciously, if you don't take a conscious, deliberate effort, you can live in pain and grief and hurt, as opposed to seeing that as a historical fact which you can't change, but you can do much more to make sure that you can be able to realize and empower people with the knowledge that they can actually they can forgive and move on, because you are not going to change anything that happened 20, 40 years ago, but you can empower that person who you can take through an education system, give them the capacity to be able to work and live anywhere. It's a tougher world, obviously, because you've got to prove yourself much more. But it is a deliberate effort that just needs many more people courageously talking about it. It's not an easy conversation, but it's one that has to be held.
So one thing that's interesting David, that's coming up for me as I'm hearing you, a different dynamic that exists here in the United States is that where we have laws on the books that are intended to eliminate racism, we still have so many systems and structures in place that are creating this dynamic. And so one of the things that's interesting here is there's another level of conversation, and I don't know, maybe this is also happening in Kenya, another level of conversation about not just being aware of power and privilege, but about reparations. And what do we do? How do those of us who have power and privilege let it go and maybe give some of it away and some of it back? And that is a really challenging and a really difficult conversation for many, many people to, you know, and I do this work all the time, and yet the idea of like, you've got to give up some of what you have, it's hard. It's really, really difficult. It's an incredibly challenging conversation. Is there, you know, as it pertains to Kenya and your experience with colonialism, is that in the conversation as well? Are there conversations about reparations?
Not so much. There's a bit of a converse to the coin here, because luckily here the majority is a person who was being colonized, as opposed to the other way around. So here you have your self-independence, you can make things happen, you can make your laws and everything. So it's just having the conversation of saying, how do you move from the past and be able to use your resources now to make it happen? You may not go backwards, but how do you move forward? Because you are a majority now, you've got your own self-government. How do you make sure that you don't keep misusing the resources and so forth? My own thoughts about the power and privilege, especially when it's allocation of resources for us, for an economy like US, my 2 cents worth would be using the systems and structures like the tax laws and everything to just get the resources to the people who are disadvantaged, and so that it's a more progressive, forward-looking, as opposed to trying and saying, you worked in a sugar plantation, your ancestors were slaves and stuff like that. You can't change that. It happened. But how can you then lift the people who are there, give them access to quality education, quality healthcare, and so on? And the power and privilege may come from those who have it through taxation and stuff like that. Would be my 2 cents worth in terms of using a systems approach, as opposed to trying to using a social approach.
Yeah, interesting. So this is a long conversation. I actually think we probably need both, because we need pressure from the bottom, and we also need pressure from the top, I think, in order to make it happen. And unfortunately, we are in an incredibly polarized political environment. So you say tax and people just immediately, but absolutely, there are incredible opportunities. I want to share one more slide with you before we close out today. And that is just some strategies for change and food for thought for anyone who wants to think about ways both on an individual level and on an organizational level, not so much in that sense of, politics and systems and structures, but thinking for ourselves as individuals and for the organizations. And again, for those of us who are coaches, and hang on, let me just get this to the right page, as coaches and thinking about the work that we're doing as coaches, and how we can how we can begin to affect some levels of change. So thinking about some strategies, and as I go through these for yourself, consider where there might be opportunities for you. What are one or two things for you in terms of next steps, thinking about what you can do when you get off of this call, what you can do tomorrow, what you can do next week, things that you can do that can help to shift the dynamic and help to move the needle. So for individuals, first and foremost, slow down and listen, become learners, and educate yourself. There's so much information out in the world, books, movies, videos, podcasts, TED Talks. Join a book group, join a mastermind. There's so many areas and opportunities for you to really educate yourself. Seek proximity. So I think about, in the United States, there are lots of people live in environments where they really never move outside of their cultural comfort zone. And so how can you expose yourself to thought leaders from other cultures, or go to a different church, or join a community group, or get involved in social action in some kind of way, and look for role models role models who represent other cultures as well. Empathize. So one of the things, there's another fantastic TED Talk by, I hope I pronounce her name correctly, Chimamanda Adichie, who has done one. She's a brilliant author, but she also has a wonderful TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story. She also does one on feminism, which is brilliant. But the danger of the single story is thinking about how easy it is for us to say, Black people are like this and women are like that, and Muslims or Jews or whatever, pick an identity group. How we tend to generalize. And so really practicing that, stretching that muscle of getting to know who people really are as individuals. Yes, Christina put that TED Talk in the chat. It's beautiful. She's a great speaker too, by the way. Anything that she does, I would listen. You can donate money or resources or provide services for individuals or groups who have traditionally been marginalized. Sign petitions and vote, depending on where you are in the world, and find opportunities to get involved, to become an ally. Maybe it's, to get involved in politics and help to put politicians in place who will enact different kinds of policies. Maybe it's social activism and doing it from the ground up, and also build resilience. And remember that this is a lifelong journey, and it can be exhausting at times. And so really practice self-care and being resilient. And then for organizations, commit to the process. A friend of mine just took a position as a chief diversity officer in a global organization, and they're looking at a program on deep listening and cultural fluency that's a year-long program. Like, they recognize that this work, again, is the work as an organization. It's a work of a lifetime. It's not a one and done. It's not a, hey, let's do an unconscious bias training and then check the box and we're done. It's top down and bottom up, as with politics. So ensure that the leadership is on board, and that you have people at all levels of the organization who are engaged. Put resources into your D&I initiatives and make sure you actually put your money where your mouth is. Be willing to interrogate reality and examine the root causes. So look at why things are happening, where the challenges are coming in, and be ruthless in the way that you explore. Connect D&I to your brand. There are a couple of organizations now in the US that have done a brilliant job of branding themselves as social justice organizations. Make sure you provide training and work on creating safer or braver spaces. So make sure that you organize and set contracts for meetings and groups, create employee resource groups. So create opportunities for people who share an identity to come together and talk. And then think about this as being part of, DEI as being part of the life cycle of your talent strategy. This is something that happens throughout, from the very beginnings where you recruit all the way through to how you identify and how you promote and how you develop leadership within your organization. So I'm going to stop there, and I thought we were going to have time for questions and answers, but I can see we are at the bottom of the hour. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Christina and say thank you so much for having me and being a part of this conversation. And I'm going to, whatever else you might need from me, I'm going to actually, I'm here and I'm available.
Thank you so much. It was a brilliant engagement in brain-wise to just think of all of these things, and the exercise of unpacking and going through those things and observing the things that we have and the things that generates or triggers our thought of what is it and how is it on the other side. And I really appreciated having also the views from David and Morten Schwartz and everyone else that just listened to it on Facebook. Has a lot of thoughts being there, and something that would be useful to look at in the coming weeks, probably even longer, because I think there's a lot of information that we need to be conscious about it. And I think we'll definitely be very happy to collect any other comments or any other questions and continue the conversation, because as you said earlier, as long as we continue to have this conversation, can only be aware of it and bring together all of the points that you shared with us before. I think that's a very useful path forward. So David, I'm really happy that you're back, and I was saying thank you so much for sharing earlier and sharing that perspective and that change. I'm more than happy if we continue the conversation. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for sharing. We look forward to the next opportunity to have a conversation on this topic and see what has happened and what has been different in the meantime until we continue to pick up, or until we pick up the conversation again.
And
any last thoughts?
We invite everybody to share their thoughts on our pages, to make comments, and we'll keep in touch and develop on this. My lesson is that when you are in power or you have privilege, you have to keep in mind what you can do for those who is not having power and privilege, and also to find ways to support them. And this is my lesson.
Thank you, Vlad. David, any last thoughts?
Thank you for inviting me. It's been quite insightful, and I look forward to more conversations like this. We need to be bold.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes, indeed. So taking that one, we will need to be bold. Say thank you so much, and let's be bold and have another talk on this one in a couple of months to see what has been different for everyone after having a chance to think of all of these things. Enjoy the rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of the week. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.